Welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. I'm very glad that you're here, and we're very excited about the presentation that we're about to experience tonight. The Gonzaga Socratic Club takes its name and inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club, the name and the motto, which is drawn from, at least paraphrased from Plato's Republic, follow the argument wherever it leads. And also the approach of the Oxford Socratic Club is mirrored by the Gonzaga Socratic Club to investigate or explore Christian worldview issues from a broadly philosophical point of view. The Oxford Socratic Club is associated with the most famous person that it's associated with, even though a lot of very famous people walked through, presented papers, commented, and there was a lively discussion at the Oxford Socratic Club that included many of the intellectual luminaries of especially the mid-1900s. The person most associated with the Oxford Socratic Club is Christian apologist, author, and scholar C.S. Lewis. He was president for the majority of the most successful and most notable years of the club's existence in the mid-1900s. The reason I bring Lewis up, well, I often mention Lewis when I'm introducing the Socratic Club and explaining what it's all about, but I have a special reason for introducing Lewis. Near the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Four Loves, which treated four of the most prominent kinds of love that we find in Greek culture. Familial love, storge, friendship, philia, romantic love, eros, and divine love, sacrificial love. It's hard to know exactly what to call it, but he calls it charity or agape, to use the Greek word. And I mention that because Lewis, I believe in writing The Four Loves, he wasn't merely telling us about human relationships, he was telling us about human nature and the human relationship with the divine. And in a way, that's what we're doing. This is the second presentation in a series of talks this semester and next semester on human nature. Gonzaga requires a course in the philosophy of human nature of all of its students, a fact I'm sure you are all aware of. But I wanted in this series for us to go deeper and explore some issues that may be touched on in human nature classes, but also give some of the faculty of the philosophy department a chance to go deeper with their own views. Our two speakers today are not only going to speak about love, they are married. We have a pair of presentations from a pair of married philosophers. Both Dr. Danielle Layne and Dr. Tyler Tritten are members of the Gonzaga Philosophy Department. Dr. Layne's expertise is in Plato and late Platonism and Neoplatonism. Dr. Tritten's expertise is in 19th century philosophy broadly, metaphysics especially. They met while they were studying in graduate school at Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. As I said, the series is really meant for us to look at human nature at a deeper level. And I think love is a particularly powerful lens or framework to use. The framework, the structure of our presentation today is we're going to have our two speakers speak. Dr. Layne first, Dr. Tritten second, and then we'll give them a chance to maybe bounce some ideas back and forth, but there will still be quite a bit of time left over for questions and discussion. So be jotting down ideas as we go, and welcome our first speaker, Dr. Layne.
I'm gonna put on a timer so that I won't run too long because I tend to talk forever. So, all right. Oh, wait. Okay, so my framework for the question of human nature, actually, I can take my mask off? Okay, all right, okay, here I go, I've taken my mask off. Crazy new world. Okay, hi, I'm Danielle Layne. So the point of departure for me with regard to the question of human nature has always been suffering, pain, brokenness. So when I first started teaching philosophy, and I would have to teach philosophies of the self and the subject, I always felt something was missing, right? Something poignant about what it means to be. And so, oh yeah, here's the title of my talk. All right, you'll understand the activate your sexy in a minute. So in any case, the point is that I started studying Plato, and what I loved about Plato was that there was an acknowledgement of the fundamentally broken aspect of what it means to be human. So I don't know how many of you guys have read the Symposium in your human nature class? Hands, show of hands, anybody? No? Well, in the beginning, or I guess midway, there is a myth presented by Aristophanes, wherein which we are these amazing beings, perfectly round, symmetrical. We have 4 arms and 4 legs, and we are proud and boastful and excited because we feel complete, so much so that we try to rival the gods. And the gods are, of course, angry by this. And so they split us in half, and we spend the rest of our lives searching for our other half. But the problem is, in Aristophanes' myth, that nothing, not even sexual love or romantic love, no matter how much you embrace your other half, you're never rejoined. And so Aristophanes' myth really emphasizes that there's no solution to the human condition. What it means to be is to be alone in your radical subjectivity, to never have that way to get to the other, so that no matter how much you love another person, they are always other to you, right? It's an asymptotic relationship for Aristophanes. However, Diotima, the speech that's presented next, emphasizes a wholly different account of the erotic and what Eros is. She describes it as a great god, okay? And she recognizes the importance of human suffering, right? That what Eros is a child of poverty and plenty, right? That its parents are the gods poverty and plenty, and in their union, the erotic is born. And the erotic is the fundamental condition of the human soul for Diotima. She says, basically, all human beings, right, have this in-between state, that we exist in this messy middle ground where we both have an element of transcendence, but also an element of immanence. That what we are is needy beings, that love is that recognition that we lack the beautiful, but we so desperately desire it. That desire actually shows our connection to that which we lack, the beautiful. And so that the erotic is actually the very condition for how we animate our entire lives. We recognize our needs, but we're able to see in that recognition of need that that's the beautiful, that's the amazing, that's knowledge. I might not have it now, but I'm going to spend my life striving for it, wanting it, seeking after it. But the most important thing about the erotic is that you have to feel that defect. You have to feel that fault. That many people for Diotima try to cover over that fault. They're taught by their society, they're taught by what it means to be human, that we're not supposed to show our suffering, our neediness, that our despair is something we need to hide. Our ignorance is something we need to pretend away. So we say, hey, I've studied a lot of Plato, so I definitely know it. I would never admit ignorance. Whereas I've been studying Plato for, 25 years, and I'm certain there's a lot I don't know. But that's part of what Diotima is saying, is recognizing that need is why you continue to search, okay? And here's a funny little quote that always stumps my students with regards to the nature of the erotic. But here it is. The erotic is the desire to give birth to the beautiful, in the beautiful, both in body and in soul. So what does that mean? Okay, so what that means for Diotima is that every human being, as an erotic being, is fallen. But within, we have this seed of resource, the seed of the divine or the transcendent, that Diotima describes as a kind of pregnancy. And that what happens in an erotic relationship is I see in you your pregnancy, your beauty, your good, your vulnerability, your intimacy. And that what I'm trying to do is to draw it out of you in a kind of giving birth, right? That when a teacher and a student have that relationship, you've seen that's the Socratic method where they're trying to bring it out of you. But that for diatoma is an erotic relationship, this relationship where in each one of your suffering, your brokenness, all your faults and everything, I can see, or your lover can see, your divine beauty. And then you reciprocate that and you see it as well. And so that what love is not only a transcendence, but it is a beautiful embodied psychic relationship where two come into connection via the very isolation or the fact of isolation or aloneness, seeing how we are torn apart, but paradoxically belonging together. And so the erotic is that strange ambiguity where we are both broken, but whole in our brokenness, that we're not trying to cover over or transcend it and pretend as if we are not suffering beings, but rather that in our suffering, there is beauty. And that beauty is part and parcel of what it means to be a human being. And I'll get to that more in a minute. But I want to emphasize that is labor easy, guys? So is the erotic relationship going to be easy? Right? Are you going to watch your lover suffer? Are you going to watch them be in pain? Yes, that's part of what it is. But that's where the divine lies. That's where the human beauty begins. Also in this story is an importance that together you travel a kind of mystagogic or telesthetic, and those are fancy 25-cent Rolodex words for cocktail parties. They basically mean, mystagogic means to lead into the mysteries or into a spiritual life. Telesthetic means to initiate or purify somebody into a higher, more spiritual life. And Diatoma, in her speech, really wants to emphasize that the erotic is this process of ascent, right? That you and your lover ascend via this recognition of the both and of what it means to be human, of the paradox of beauty being in your brokenness, all right? And so here, that beauty being in your brokenness, something I've been forgetting to emphasize with that giving birth to the beautiful, this is the creativity, this is the power, right? So this is when somebody's dancing and you can see the good shimmering on their skin or singing and that shiver run down your back, or the story that you read and you can feel Hemingway's pain and know that you're connected strangely to a living being who is no longer alive. This is what I call that kind of illumination of the good, not transcendent or not, but right here, lighting this particular moment right now. Oops. All right, let's move that. So this isn't just in Plato's Symposium, but I would argue this is throughout all of Plato. So unfortunately for many of you in this room, you may have gotten a really stale version of Plato. That's no beef to your professors, but it's the common way to teach Plato, that Plato is about this world of the intelligible and this world of the sensible, and never the two shall they meet. And it's actually, if you get into the dialogues, you actually see that the erotic is a fundamental principle of connection that runs throughout all of his dialogues. The Phaedrus is another really great example of this. And one of the reasons why I like the Phaedrus almost more the Symposium, because it's also philosophically more heady in some ways, but it also shows there are two different ways Eros can go. So as beings who are messy and complex, do we always go the transcendent way with the erotic? Don't we objectify? Aren't we cruel? Aren't we tyrannical? Don't we want to possess the ones we love, right? And this is the thing about the erotic. It can go both ways, right? Since it itself is this playfulness in the between, it definitely can become this thing that we pervert and we manipulate. And we fail to remember that what it means to be erotic beings is to be beings searching for authentic connection. We turn that connection into a tyranny over the other, or need to possess the other, or to objectify the other. And so we see this in the Phaedrus, and it's juxtapositioned with a kind of love that is both spiritual and embodied. Here also in the Phaedrus, The erotic is the divine animating principle of the soul, right? And so the soul is described as that which can move itself. And so when we're thinking about what moves you, what moves your soul, this for Plato is that erotic desire to be otherwise than you are. But in that being otherwise, being perfectly who you are. He describes it as having a pair of winged horses, one dark and one white. One's unruly, but one's also ruly, I guess. It listens to you. And some people want to compare the dark horse to that erotic element, that appetite. But I actually think it maps better onto the lineage of Eros itself, of poverty and plenty. That there's a horse that represents the plenty, our ability to do so many things, our transcendence, our magnitude, our creativity. But then we also have the dark horse, or the impoverished part of our erotic soul, which actually causes us to struggle, right? To really work towards what it is that we know to be good and beautiful and true. And so here, the erotic desire, when turned towards the complex divinity of our beloved in the Phaedrus, is what allows us to regrow our wings, so that we're described as beings with these wings. But the human condition is one in which we've trampled over our wings. We don't have them anymore. But when I'm with my erotic companion and we are turned towards seeing the complexity of what it means to be human, our creativity, our power, our animating life force, which isn't just beautiful, but also ugly, we start to regrow our wings because we recognize that we need to stimulate one another. We need to draw out one another's power or animating force. Another aspect of this text is also the importance of the dialectician. And the dialectician is basically the good teacher. Okay, so that in the Phaedrus, the image of the good teacher is one who can see the multiplicity of individuals and the kinds of souls. So for Plato, individual souls were all radically other and different. Again, this is why we have an erotic condition, because if we were fundamentally the same, we would be connected automatically. We wouldn't need to work on our relationships. We wouldn't need to draw out and recognize one another's power. Because we're different, there's actual need for touch or contact or communion. And so the dialectician is one who can see the plurality or difference in a variety of different souls and see what they need, i.e., what are they pregnant with? And how might I be able to draw it out? And to give different speeches for different kinds of souls, depending upon their particular need, or as Diotima would put it, pregnancy. So not to get too boring, but there's some drier dialogues where this is also evident. Dialogues like the Timaeus, the Sophist, or the Republic. The Timaeus imagines the human being as created of the circles of the same and the different. Okay, so again, we see that lineage of Eros from poverty and plenty. So the circle of the same would be the plenty or the resource aspect of what it means to be human. But the circle of the other or the different is where our need and confusion, our perplexity lie. And that what it means to be human, as he says in the Timaeus, is to be turned upside down, to be born upside down, with as if we're trees with our roots in the air and our leaves in the ground. And the project of what it means to be human is to strengthen and turn ourselves upwards, and to recognize the harmony and the rotation between the same and the other. The Sophist describes, it's a dialogue ostensibly about being and not being, where not being is described not as the privation or nothingness. So that, this, I guess I can do this. So my son always says, Mom, spell nothing. And I say N-O-T, and he goes, no, that's not nothing, that's something, right? No, okay, that's a really good joke. The point is that Plato in that text wants to emphasize, like Parmenides, that the opposite of being isn't nothing, right? Nothing can't be. The opposite of being is relative being, right? Being that is otherwise than being, but related to being. And so when we think about that world of the intelligible as being, the realm of being, the realm of the sensible, this world of embodied lives, of psychic lives, it's not the illusion. So some of your professors might have called this world the illusion or the false, right? That would be to think not being as nothingness. This is nothing. It doesn't matter. And when I describe human suffering, I want you guys to put yourself in that place of when you feel you are nothing, you don't matter, you're empty, right? And that here, what Plato is saying is that nothingness isn't real. All of being, all this otherwise than being, which is the opposite of being. It's not the pure opposite of nothingness, but it's always relational being. So what the erotic is that principle that images the life of the intelligible, that what here the embodied, sensible, psychic world is the image of being in relation, right? So that's why Eros has to be the both and. That's why our lives have to be the both and. This is also in the Republic. He talks about it, though, in terms of the masculine and the feminine. But the way to translate that without getting into a long argument about the Republic, and you're more than welcome to ask me why I read it that way, because that'll be a lot of fun. But I argue that it's the equiprimordial nature of the feminine, the masculine, is the equiprimordial nature of the unlimited aspect of what it means to be human, alongside this ability to limit or define or to know, right? So that knowing and not knowing belong together to the human being. Knowing is that limiting, defining, 2 + 2 = 4, that's true. But then the unlimited is that recognition that when I talk to you, I can tell you're a sensitive being, but I can't tell you how I know that, right? It is the aporetic, it is the confused, but it's also the site of potentiality. That site of perplexity is a site of unlimited resource. So what I'm trying to argue is the resource is in the deficiency, in the I don't know, in the aloneness, in the suffering. And he calls this weakness in the text, but Socrates throughout the text always invokes his own weakness, his own confusion of not knowing. And so I think reinforcing himself in that embodied way, the importance of being both a knowing and not knowing creature. All right. I could go on forever. Let's see how I'm doing on time. I have 2 minutes, so I'm not going to go on forever. My work is really on Neoplatonism, right? And Neoplatonism really emphasizes that the forms, right? Being and intellect are mediated by the power of life, okay? And life is what connects and makes being whole in one. And it's the processive power that substantiates the otherness, even within being itself. But in the intelligible realm, it's not completely processive. It hasn't outgone. But in the psychic realm, or relative life, as I'm talking about it here, the life that moves in time, it is by necessity outside. There is a outside that images even the otherness in being, right? That in being, thought being, there is an otherness, but the embodied sensible world separates it, makes it real, so to speak. And so we have this work in which we have to do the kinds of works that show connection, that recognize that what it means to be human is to constantly connect with one another, and transcend and produce the kind of beauty that shows that there is contact and touch with what is other. Because as images of being, that is what the erotic being is supposed to do, right? And so here, let me see. Oh, and I emphasize in being, it's eternity, right? Like it's absolute. It's never going to become otherwise because it's eternal. But we are temporal beings. We move in time, right? And so our erotic creative projects, right? When we produce a song or write a great story or give an okay lecture, what's happening is that we are showing the beauty of this temporal life and connecting. So what's being shown is not the beauty of just this temporal life. When you watch something, it inspires you. It shows you the beauty of the eternal, paradoxically, in the temporal. All right. Before I end, I want to emphasize again that kind of way that the erotic or the sexy can in fact be misused. We could talk about that more. It's a real risk to try to activate your erotic or to live an erotic life, because it means you have to be vulnerable. You have to be ready to risk everything, showing that you are stupid or foolish or not hopeful sometimes, right? That you are indeed like Aristophanes' soul. I also want to know, you guys know that a lot of my work on the erotic is connected to intersectional feminist authors like Audre Lorde, who wrote way back a few decades ago, or 3 decades ago. I'm forgetting how old I am, 4 decades ago, that the erotic has often been the thing that the oppressor is afraid of in others. So that what patriarchal cultures do is see this erotic messiness and regulate it to the realm of the feminine. The masculine doesn't want the erotic as part of what it means to be human. And so that turns it into the site of the feminine, the site of people of color or those we wish to colonize, and say, that's yours. And it's not good. It's the site of sex, it's the site of emotion, it's the site of all the things that we want to excise from what it means to be human. What I am is a subject of self, what I need to obtain is autonomy, freedom, rationality, and all of that other stuff, that madness, that messiness, that belongs to the realm of those we regulate to the marginalized corners. And I think Audre Lorde says it really well when she says the erotic has become the pornographic. So often, many people will confuse erotic with the pornographic, that process of objectifying or turning somebody into a plasticized sensation. It is what the oppressor fears in the other, in himself, and so empties it of value, attempts to destroy it, possess it, gain dominion over it. And down here, the erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feeling. It is the internal requirement towards excellence, from which our language, our history, our dancing, our loving, our work, our very lives give testament to. Just a couple more, bear with me. I want to give voice to these amazing feminists. Here, Luganis describes, so often those who wish to deny the erotic as part of what it means to be human, that what it means is to connect with others, is that they practice this form of argumentation and seeing others agonistically in a kind of warlike state. I'm going to win. I'm going to beat you. And this is very prevalent in philosophy. Who knows philosophy majors like this? I'm going to win the argument. I know better. And here, that's not very platonic or very erotic of those philosophy students. What we want to do is something that Maria Luganis emphasizes, which is to world travel and to playfully world travel, to look for ways in which we can disagree with one another and find ways to enter into each other's world compassionately, erotically, lovingly. Here's another one of my favorite quotes. This playfulness is in part an openness to being a fool, which is a combination of not worrying about competence, not being self-important, not taking norms as sacred, and finding ambiguity and double edges a source of delight. And so here is also this importance of an erotic methodology, where you understand you're going to look like a fool sometimes. You're going to look silly, but that's part of your beauty. That's part of what makes you amazing. And then mestiza consciousness from Gloria Anzaldúa is also, again, this kind of embodied emphasis of there being this divine, sacred aspect within the human being that is, she invokes this serpent goddess Guadalupe, which is neither beautiful nor ugly, but the source of both. It is this in-between state, a crossing between borderlands, developing a tolerance for contradiction, a tolerance for ambiguity. Not only does she sustain contradictions, she turns ambivalence, the paradox of what it means to be, into something else. All right, and I'll end on this note. Is this what Plato really meant? Is this what he intended when he was advancing his theory of the erotic? And I always come back to this quote from the Symposium, where he emphasized what it is to give birth, that what we do when we're searching after knowledge is giving birth to new ideas. And here he says, or Diotima says, it is a divine affair, this engendering and bringing to birth an immortal element in the creature that is mortal. Every mortal thing is preserved in this way. not by keeping it exactly the same forever, like the divine, but by replacing what goes off or is antiquated with something fresh in the semblance of the original. And what this means for me is that every human being in this room is tasked to constantly give birth to the beautiful. And you know what? That beautiful painting that you did last week, or that beautiful speech you gave the week later, that's not the end. You have to keep doing it. And your relationship to your truth or your ideas will transform and change. But that does not mean you're relativistic or that you're completely changing and becoming completely otherwise, but that you're connected to this constant process of becoming otherwise than being, becoming otherwise than the same. That what it means to be is that you're going to revisit truth again and again and again, and it is a never-ending task. And strangely, paradoxically, that never-ending task is the simplicity of the good in your life right now. All right.
Good. Welcome. Thank you. So I have a PowerPoint, and I think this is maybe the second time, according to my recollection, that I've ever used a PowerPoint. So let me first see, and I'm not just talking for like a public presentation, but even in like classes or the classroom, I never do it. It's normally not my style, but I'll tell you why today. But let me see if I'm smart enough. I just click. Oh, wow. I think I can do this. All right. So the reason I've decided for a PowerPoint, even though it's not traditionally what I do, is because I'm going to try to juggle 3 balls in about 20 minutes, and 3 complicated balls in 20 minutes. And those are, number 1, to tell you what my theory of human nature is, which could be a whole presentation. And by that, I mean, what's the mind-body relation, or what's the soul-body relation? Secondly, is to tell you about Christology. So the person in the Christian tradition, or the Judeo-Christian tradition, the person of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, we want to say God and man at the same time, or something like, let's say, pure spirit and body at the same time. So I think that analogies or parallels can be made between positions in Christology and traditional positions in body-soul relationships in human nature. And then thirdly, what is love in the sense of agape? Now, the title of the whole program is Eros versus Agape. We might find, so I'm ultimately going to argue, so here's the claim, that agape is superior to Eros because only agape is a divine love. She disagrees, and we might find, though, it depends on which divinity we're talking about. So what I'm going to say might be very specific and very peculiar to the Christian deity, and maybe wouldn't be true of pagan deities or other deities. But that's the claim anyway, and so I'll stand by it. I won't back off of the claim. And so, yeah, and then we can go back to this slide later if you want, but maybe in the bold here, I will ultimately insist that only agape and not Eros is divine, not despite its ugliness and humiliation and lowliness and degradation, but precisely because it is so lowly, degrading, humiliating, etc. But this is what love calls you to do, is to humble yourself before the others, make yourself nothing for the others. And we see this in Christology as well. All right. So that's the claim. That's interesting stuff, but we have to do some, arcane philosophy as well, because I am a philosopher at the end of the day. And so sometimes, whether we talk about Christology and we ask what is the divine nature, or we talk about human nature, and I want to know what is the nature of the human being. But I really want to put an emphasis on being rather than nature, with the emphasis on being as a verb. So in a sentence like, Bob is being a human being, the word being occurs 2 times, but once as a noun and once as a verb. And I really, really want to insist that we try to think of being as a verb here, rather than as a noun, in which case it could be something like a synonym for nature or essence, as it were. So natures don't be, but being natures. In other words, if we begin with 2 distinct natures, like the body and the soul, and then ask how are we going to put them together, It's like you going to Vegas and thinking you're going to win money. The cards are stacked against you. The rules are set up so that you cannot win. Can't be done. Or if I say I have a divine nature and I have a human nature, and then I'm going to put them together and I'm going to get the man God, I'm like, no, it can't be done. You cannot start with two natures and then bring them together. But what you can do is start with one verb or one activity that then bifurcates itself into two natures. So two natures can follow one enactment, but I can't start with two and put them together. That's the basic premise. And so that one with which I'm starting is not a nature, but it's a verb. It's an act or an enactment. And I have done here that one could make a homology between the medieval dictum that in God act precedes potency or act precedes essence, or one could think in a more contemporary vein of existentialists who say, now I've lost the famous line, human beings' essence is their existence or their act. Yeah, existence precedes essence. My goodness, yes, that's what I wanted to say. Or action precedes nature. All right. So let's see if I can play it. Good. Neither dualism nor reductionism. So I want to say Descartes is wrong. There is, if I have the mind as one kind of substance and I have the body as another kind of substance, I can't put them together. That's dualism. I think dualism is nonsense philosophically. I think dualism is also dangerous psychologically, medically, all sorts of problems with it that I don't have the time to go into, but no good, right? But also in Christology, there are certain forms of dualism as well, right? So human body, but divine mind, and I think of them as totally distinct, but I say, well, magically, they exist in the same person. We could call this Apollinarism. Or some people, most people say, yeah, I agree with you, Tyler. Dualism is bad. And so one obvious tactic to avoid dualism is to get rid of one or the other half of the dualism. And so if you say, well, let's get rid of the mind half of the dualism, and you say, what do you call consciousness? That's just merely some ephemeral experience that's really only the result of brain states and atoms colliding or something like that, right? So in materialism, you could think of epiphenomenalism, behavioralism, various kinds of naturalisms, be they soft or hard, I think would fall on this kind of reductionism. And on the side of Christology, we could call this adoptionism or Arianism, which is to say, Jesus really is a human and really does have a human body, but he's not really divine, or only seems to be divine, or is not divine in origin, or something of the sort, right? But I think this is the parallel that we can make here. Or the other way of being reductionist, to say dualism's bad, let's lop off one side or the other of the dualism, is to lop off the body side and say I'm a pure soul without a body. The body's just an appearance, right? And then how would this correspond to Christology? Docetism, which just means seeming or appearance, or modalism, so that what we really have is divinity in the person of Jesus, and he just seems to have a body, but that's just an apparition. If you could actually see the true nature of things, you would just see pure divinity or something of the sort. Is that fair enough for everyone, though? I mean, there's a lot of detail in all of these positions that I'm admittedly passing over, but I think an analogy can be made. So one might say, well, great, not dualism, not reductionism. Why not go with hylomorphism, a classic Aristotelian position? This slide is really ugly. My whole presentation is really ugly compared to activating your beautiful and activating your sexy. But in any event, what's happening here? I don't like hylomorphism because, and someone might quibble with me here and have a different reading or a different interpretation of Aristotle. And if that's so, we can discuss that in the Q&A. But I think the basic problem with Aristotle is that hylomorphism is a composition of form and matter. But Aristotle says form can exist on its own. There's something like pure form, or God is pure act. And he says, even though he kind of waffles on this a lot, at least in places, he seemingly says, and matter or prime matter can exist on its own, apart from form, even if he sort of immediately reneges that statement. And so I still think Aristotle begins with two things that he thinks distinctly, and then says, how can I smush them together? And I want to say, you can't. It just can't be done. So I'm going to argue in my Christology for a kind of monophysitism or meophysitism, which is to say, I don't begin with two natures and make one, but I begin with one, mono, and then that single enactment bifurcates into two natures. So I can end with dual natures, but I can't begin with them. Dualism starts with two natures. I'm going to have a theory of human nature I'll call immanent monism, which starts with one, but it ends in two. And that's the difference. And in monothelitism, that means one will. So that in Jesus, the human will and the divine will are the same will, as it were. There's not two wills at war in that person. All right. And I think I already discussed some of these anti-Aristotelian axioms, no compounds. He thinks two distinct things and wants to make a compound. I also am not a substance theorist. Again, I'm not beginning with a nature or a substance. I'm beginning with a pure verb. Substances are the effects of verbs, right? In other words, nouns don't verb, right? Things don't do things. Nouns don't verb, but verbing nouns, right? Acting things, as it were. Yeah, but not for Aristotle. And so therefore there's also no intellechy. What is intellechy? In Aristotle, he says you have a nature, and when that thing fulfills its nature or actualizes its nature, then it finally is what it is. But I want to say, if a thing doesn't have a pre-given nature, there's also no such thing as the actualization of that nature. So I have to reject any notion of intellechy. Okay, so let's speak some Christology here. If you know John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, or in the beginning was the Logos, or in the beginning was the verb or the verbum, if you're reading it in Latin, right? In the beginning was the expressing. Again, think of this as a verb, not some expression, but expressing, expressivity. And it was God, right? And I want to say so that the middle term between the dual natures is neither human nor divine, but it is this logos or this word. And I should have quoted it, but if some of you know Philippians 2, the so-called kenosis hymn, or Christ hymn, and it says that God took on human form, etc., etc. Well, it doesn't quite actually say that. The subject that took on human form is never said to be God, right? It says that the same that was in the morphe theou, in the form of God, is the same that was in morphe anthropos, or in the form of human being. And so I want to say that the subject wasn't God that became human, nor was the subject the human that became God, but the subject is a distinctly third thing that is properly neither human nor divine, but just something else entirely, namely logos, or the word. So that the same that is God is the same that is human. But that's different from saying God became human, and that's different from saying the human became God. But a third thing that's neither of the two became both. Yeah, and again, follow up in the Q&A, but okay. So we can say therefore that Jesus as the Christ, it isn't the case that he's God despite being human, but he's only God because he is human. This is a sort of scandalous claim I want to make in my Christology. But I want to say that had Jesus not been incarnate, had the Logos not been incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, then he wouldn't be God. So he isn't God despite his humanity, but only because of his humanity. Because humanity and divinity are both consequences of a loving enactment. Great, but which love then? What's love? Let's finally get around to defining what agape is. Okay, so Dr. Calhoun mentioned earlier that some people like C.S. Lewis will translate agape as charity, which actually comes from the Greek word charis, which is our usual word for grace, which means something like a free or an unmerited gift, right? Other translations of agape, sometimes it's rendered as unconditional love. I'm a little bit okay with this, but I think there are some problems, because I think when one is in a love relationship, no matter what kind of love it is, the fact that you are in that relationship makes certain demands upon you. But those demands didn't exist beforehand, those demands are accrued insofar as you are in that relationship, right? So I want to rather say it's an pre-conditional love, but there might be post-conditions that are accrued by being in the love relationship. Sacrificial love is a nice translation of this, but I'd really like to try to explicate agape as substitution. Substitution. So hopefully this will be clear what that means. All right. Okay. So being, again, I'm not writing human being, but being, emphasis on the verb, the being, what it means to be a human is responsibility. How am I defining responsibility here? Well, first I'll say how most people define responsibility. For most people, responsibility is a property that I can only have if I'm the author of a certain action. So that if someone wants to blame something on me and it wasn't my fault, they say, "Oh, that wasn't me. That was Dandy. Blame. She's responsible. Blame her. She was the author of that action, or she was the author of that event, whatever." But that's not how I'm using the word responsibility. I'm using the word responsibility in the sense of Emmanuel Levinas as responsibility is being put in the position of having to give response for oneself and the other. What responsibility is finding oneself already existing in the state of having to give an account of oneself and the other. Both, which means I bear not only responsibility for myself, but I also bear the weight of the being of the other person's being, right? I'm also responsible for them. In a certain sense, I'm responsible for every ill in the world in this sense of responsibility. Good. And so my being stems from the other. When I first came to consciousness, I wasn't a blank slate, but when I first came to consciousness, I came to consciousness with the recognition that I already had a large number of debts and guilt and responsibility to other people. Like my parents, otherwise I wouldn't even exist, for example. I owe them something, right? Or the doctors, or my sibling, or my friends, right? I find myself never in a neutral state, but always being indebted to the other person. And so my very being stems from the other person. And if I'm going to therefore have to carry their being in turn, well, what does it mean to carry the being of the other? This is how I'm going to use the term maternity. In fact, that's what maternity is carrying the being of another person, or at least as I'm using it here. Good. So, what's my theory on body and soul? Note here in the first bullet point, I have my in scare quotes. My body is my being there for the other, right? What do I mean by this? If you read Plato and you get the story of where this guy says, well, what would you do if you could make yourself invisible? And then you find out he does all sorts of terrible things and he steals stuff. Because what does it mean to be invisible? It means you can act without consequence. But what does it mean to be invisible? To be invisible, I take it, is to exist without a body. That's what it means to be invisible, to exist without a body. And when I exist without a body, that means I can exist only for myself rather than having to exist for the other. So what is the conclusion I draw from this? That my body is my being, not for me, my body, but my body is my being for the other. That's what my body is. It's a kind of, my body is a public phenomenon. If I didn't have a body, I could just be alone. But I can't just be alone because I have a body. So my body is my being, fundamentally not mine, but it's my being for the other. Scandalized some of you, I can tell, so far. But I'll continue. And what is a body? A body is a thing that occupies a space. Only a body is there, or over there, or here. So as Descartes would say in his dualism, it's an extended thing. So if I am set before the other and have to give response before the other, this being responsible to and for the other simply is my incarnation, simply is my embodiment. It's not the case that I have a body, therefore I'm responsible before others. Rather, I'm responsible before others, therefore I'm an embodied thing. Yeah? Therefore, I'm an incarnate thing. Or what is my mind then, or my intellect, or my soul? It's my being in a position of having to give an account of myself, of having to respond, of having to think for myself and for the other. So it's not the case that I am a thing with a mind, therefore I respond to the other, but rather I have to respond to the other, therefore I'm an ensouled thing. Therefore I'm a minded thing, as it were. Right? So in the beginning was expression, in the beginning was word. I'm addressed, I'm expressed to, and my very being arises as responsivity to that address. And that responsivity locates me before the other, hence I'm embodied. And that responsivity demands an account of myself, hence I'm an ensouled thing. So that my passivity before the other is my incarnation and my ensoulment in one. That my body and my soul arise as consequences of this original being responsible to and for the other. I'm not a body and soul, and then I accrue responsibilities. I am responsible. That is my being. Therefore, I'm a bodied thing and a soul thing. Okay. And so, if I really look, and I'll, if you want, or if Dr. Besmer wants, you can ask me about flesh later, but I'll skip that for now. So I want to say, so too, remember our parallels with Christology, and that this enactment in Christology of the human and the divine was an Agapeic enactment. So I ought, in my being as body and soul, I ought also to live agapeically. So what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. To love agapeically is to deny oneself in order to not deny the other person that which is their being by right. Because I bear the being of the other and they bear mine, right? And so, in other words, this is the long-handed definition of don't murder. That's what murder means. What does it mean to murder? Well, to take away the being of the other. That's what murder is. So every time I go under I-95 and someone asks me for money and I take the urinal technique and pretend like they don't exist and were never born, I'm murdering. Because I'm revoking the other's right to be. Or I'm acting as though they don't. That's what murder is to revoke the being of the other. Using some terms in strange ways here, I understand, but I think that's how we can say it. And so to love agapeically is to substitute for the other's needs, wants, and even their sins, to bear their responsibility even for their faults. It is to be not just a body, but a broken body. I'm wounded by the other. I only am a body because the other is always already underneath my skin. I don't have a body, and then some people can agitate me and get underneath my skin, but because the other is underneath my skin, that's the condition of my inskinment. I only am a skinned being because the other is underneath of my skin. I don't have skin and others get underneath, but others are underneath it. Therefore, I'm a skinned thing, a thing with skin. This brokenness, this woundedness just is my ensoulment or my inspiriting. Hence, the word inspiration, right, is simply to be breathed into or to be inspirited. I'm always inspired by the word of the other. Okay, and enthusiasm is the same thing. Enthusiasm means in theos or in God, is to be enthused. But good. So I'm not incarnate despite being a soul, but only because I'm ensouled, and the inverse. They're both two sides of the same coin. So what is an ethics of divine love? It's substitute your being or your rights for the other. As Jesus, the Messiah, substituted being that could have been his by right, the world, gave it back to God. Just as if I love agapeically Not only do I not use all of my rights that are at my disposal, but I will even let the other take what is mine by right and use it against me. In fact, the other can use my own rights against me. That's what it is to love Agapeic, I think. So, note in biblical things, the last shall be first, blessed are the meek, the humble, the poor in spirit. Or Paul says, foolishness is the wisdom of God and weakness is the power of God. Up is down and left is right. If you want something like common sense, don't read the Gospels. But I mean that seriously. So we have two loves, and I think this is my last slide. I don't know that Dr. Layne would say all of this, but at least according to caricatures of what Eros is, it's a yearning or a striving. Whereas on the other hand, agape is self-denial, self-mortification. Eros is thought as will to power, the expansive power. I create and my power exudes outwards, where agape is refrain, silence, humiliation, degradation. Agape is something like self-surpassing, becoming more. I'm thinking here of Nietzsche and various people, whereas agape is delimiting. So imagine most people think that in Genesis 1:1, and God created the heavens and the earth, and most of us think of this as God is so powerful and he caused something and boom, his power went outward. And I want to say, no, actually, if God is an infinite being, he takes up all space, and there is no space for anyone else. So the creative act is God saying, oh my gosh, I have to make myself small so that there's space for another to exist. So I already want to think Genesis 1:1 is an act of agape or self-limiting, where creation isn't power going outwards, but creation is God making himself really tiny so that there's finally space for something else to exist. Because if God remains in his infinity, then there ain't no space for you or you, right? But fair enough. Eros is self-actualizing. So think Aristotle, intellechy. I have various potencies and I need to actualize them. Everything I can do, I must do, as it were. And agape is other actualizing and self-de-actualizing, if you will. Eros fights for its rights to be, fights for its rights to grow, fights for its rights to expand. And I want to say agape abandons my own rights and lets the other use them against me. And finally, and ultimately, I want to say Eros is a principle of being in life. Whereas agape could never be a principle or a cause, it could only be something personal. Only a person could deny themselves for me. It can't be an inanimate whooshing forth like a principle or a cause. So it's the opposite of intellechy, it's the opposite of conatus, it's the opposite of life force or vitality or elan vital, it's the opposite of will to power, it's the opposite of all of these things. And then there was nothing. So thank you.
I really don't know what to say. I think we fundamentally, so my husband and I fundamentally agree on a lot of things, but we also fundamentally disagree on a lot of things. And one of the things that I noted while he was talking was that I think we both agree that love, right, whether we call it the erotic or we call it agapeic, is this principle of connection and relationship with the other, and that the other is fundamentally part and parcel of what it means for me to be, for us to be human at all, that there's no such thing as the isolated individual. I believe that we're all, in some sense, radically alone in our subjectivity. That's why we are so desperate, why it is that we need, because we recognize that there's something wrong with that aloneness, but that we all have windows, yes. And I'm arguing that the erotic is that which allows us to actually touch one another, because in that aloneness, in that poverty of the human being, in that weakness of the human being is the resource, right? That what we're doing, so one of the things I might disagree with him in his conception of the erotic, he uses the Aristotelian idea of actualization, right? Where I get up here and I actualize my sexy and I've done it, right? I've actualized my erotic and I'm done. I've achieved what it means to be an amazing effing human being, right? Where I show you the messiness of what it means to be while also being strong and courageous and powerful and whatnot. But the point is that is never complete for a Platonist, because we're still always incomplete. So that's why you're tasked to do it every day, every second. It's a never-ending task. But somehow, in that showing that it's a never-ending task, that I have to make another work of art, another speech, another talk, another student, another relationship, another friend, that in that incompleteness where I'm constantly striving and living that life of showing that incompleteness, I show the completeness of being human, right? That's the weird paradox of being complete in the incomplete, being beautiful in the ugly, right? I feel like there was something else. Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of completeness, I think there are at least two different ways that something could be incomplete. Something could be incomplete because it's sort of undefined, it's effusive, etc. But there's another sense in which something could be incomplete because it never finishes. And I think here I wanted to fight very hard against the notion of love as power or will to power, right? And it's because I think if we think in those terms, power will never, ever, ever be diffused. But power must always be met by counterpower, and then counterpower by counterpower, etc. And I want to say that what Agape does is it doesn't meet a power with a counterpower, but it just pulls the rug out from underneath and refuses the power. So if someone calls you an idiot at school and you say, no, you're not an idiot, you're a jerk. And then they say, well, you're not a jerk, you're a moron. And they say, well, you're not a moron, right? And this feeds on itself. It doesn't dissipate the tension, but it makes it greater, 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 greater. Whereas if someone can take evil, can take heap and scorn and not return in kind, then it dies. And the power game ends.
So this is
nowhere to go.
This is so he's making this distinction between kinds of power, and so was I, right? So one of the things that I was doing when I was trying to show different kinds of love. So power typically thought is power over or dominion over. So this is, think about the erotic in that tyrannical sense where I need to own the other. I need to turn that sexy person into an object that I lust over, right? They're just something I can objectify and use. And so this is that typical like power over another, or I'm going to come in and conquer kind of power. But erotic power, right, is empowerment, right? So he wants to say Agapeic is emptying out of power, and I want to say no, it's to show that power as dominion actually exposes the need, that the power of dominion is the erotic perverted. That we do this because we get lost in our desperation and our neediness. And so we think that the only way to be powerful, to enact our power, is to use and abuse and to turn others into objects or to things, to murder them metaphorically and literally. But that, if you look at people like that, and it's that sad twist of power actually being quite impotent and not recognizing that if they just sat back and recognized that their own neediness, that's how they connect and enact their power, right? It's by taking that force that they are trying to use to control others so that they think they mean something. So they're trying to construct meaning through this perverted sense of power, and it's forcing them to be separated all the more. It's when we let go of power as over another and recognize it as power is in the connection with the need, that I need the needy in you. And that's the power of being human.
So I would rebut that with something brilliant, but I'll refrain because we're already, hour, a little more. So do we want to do Q?
Sure. You guys can take that. Right. So questions, comments?
Yeah. Okay. I'm really hard of hearing, so I'm so sorry.
When you're talking about your argument of the public, is there a way to read that through a non-gender binary lens, like through more than just
Yes. So I in a lot of my published works, I argue for the queer soul in Plato and the Platonic tradition, because of this idea that what's happening in the Republic, I would argue, is this image of the soul as needing the ruling of both male and female parts of the soul equally. What that male and female is mapped onto a kind of Pythagorean binary that they create, which is this binary between the principle of the limit and the principle of the unlimited, or the principle of a kind of reasoning that is mad and chaotic and intuitive and playful and always potentially becoming otherwise, and that kind of reasoning that's more definite, rational, logical, things like this. And that we need both to be good philosophers, or to rule what it means to be human. So fundamentally, that there is no strict embodied female or male or Platonists, but that there is a fundamental queerness in the soul, and that if we deny either side, then we're doing the human soul an injustice. We're not invoking the erotic power of what it means to be human. And this is picked up again in a lot of later Neoplatonists who want to emphasize they validate various different gender orientations, sexual orientations that we acknowledge today. At least I would argue. Not everybody. David would probably disagree with me like crazy on this reading of Plato, but it's there.
So I had a question kind of related to the idea of you talked about Marxization and how sometimes we have a tendency to take the erotic in kind of the colloquial sense, like we push it into the category of the pornographic. But my question is about for a lot of, like, especially in the context of Christianity, the pornographic or the expectation ought not to have a place even on that spectrum. It's in the center of identity, more on the margins. And so when we talk about the other, isn't it appropriate that the other is towards the margins? Because it's not that the other is towards the margins, or at least pushed out towards the margins. We use this potentiality for, the center of identity, thinking spatially right now in the circle of thing. Isn't it appropriate that it is out there, so that when you go to the margins, or when you approach someone other, another identity, they are on the boundary of you, and that's part of the reason why you desire them on the boundary of you. But you wouldn't be able to totally fit other into the center, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the question makes sense. Sorry.
I'm not sure I understand. So I'm wondering if we're in agreement, and so correct me where I'm confusing it and not understanding what you're distinctly trying to say. So you want to say that the other always remains other, right? Always on the margin.
In a sense, yeah, not always, because you can bring the other in sometimes and use it, like you said, for potentiality. It's the potential, it's the place where you take resource in that sense. But also it kind of has to stay towards the outside. It can't, I don't want to, this sounds negative, it can't contest if the identity in the center, like it has to stay towards the margins.
Okay, so again, correct me if I'm misunderstanding. So here, Tyler, right? Let's say, so I'm wondering if there's a confusion about the use of marginalization and this idea of the other. So that I would argue that in certain conceptions of power, the other is marginalized because of a fear of their power, right? And so within the erotic, there's a recognition, like we get rid of that fear. Like we know it's a risk, we know it's a threat to our identity to let the other in. But the point is that we do, and we let it transform us, while at the same time recognizing there's always a constant othering, right? That there is going to be a new task, right? So that the social justice activism will never end, right? There will never be, for us as embodied temporal psychic beings, a day where we all sing Kumbaya and finally get along. The erotic recognizes, no, tomorrow I might do a good in explicating Audre Lorde's theory of the erotic. It might have empowered others to see its value, but that's not enough, because tomorrow it could be perverted again and again and again. Is that answering the question?
It does clarify.
Okay.
And if I say, for me, it's not the case that the other would be on the margins of the periphery. I'm on the margins of the periphery, and the other is my center. So there is no movement from self to other, but the movement is from other to self. So when I say I, and grammatically we say, oh, that's a first person pronoun, and you is a second person pronoun, but I want to say the grammar is all wrong here, or it doesn't actually map onto the ontology of things. In the ontology of things, the other is the first term, and the condition of me subsequently coming about as a response, a belated, necessarily belated response to that other, so that what you all call the I, that's not a first, that's a second person in the you. There's no movement self to other, as if I'm already here, and then I may or may not let others in, but the other already always has inhabited me before I was there to recognize.
And here, he's trying to emphasize, the importance of kenosis or emptying. Agapeic love is an emptying of yourself for the other. And I want to say the erotic begins in the emptiness, right? It's not that's not something we do. We don't empty ourselves, but rather we sit up at night and we start to recognize the real possibility, the real threat of the nothingness of your existence, of the meaninglessness of it all. The words coming out of my mouth right now matter not. We begin with this kind of estrangement from being. And that what the erotic is that, but I say no. And that connect, it's only possible for me to say no or to desire or to be afraid of that nothingness because I want and need, and that wanting and needing signals of something other, right? That there's something outside of resting in this emptiness. And that can be fulfilled or made beautiful, I guess, through erotic love of the other, whether it be the other in front of me or the divine other. Yes, because the other in front of me is also divine. The divine in me. So it fills me up rather than empty.
And I want to ask this question, but I can avoid a different sense of nothingness. I said if your body is a public phenomenon, so your mind or your soul, we often speak of as a space of interiority. But I only have that inner or that interiority because the other has hollowed me out. But again, I'm not there, and then the other hollows me out. The other, my being is a being hollowed out by the other. That is just what I am all the way down. I would say.
Go ahead, Evelyn.
Okay, so it's kind of on that notion of like the erotic is derived from a laugh and then Agape, I don't know exactly how to reference it, is like the act of emptying. So that like of itself, like it is the other, like that is why itself exists. So then what are the theories of selves? So if you are, it's like the erotic is derived from a laugh, which is like something, I guess, a void, something that's vacuous. Then what does that mean about operational state before making action, before the act?
So one more time, I'm trying to.
No,
I'm hard of hearing. That's all I know. I need to have to yell. I'm an old woman. Sorry.
So if the erotic is derived from a vacuous state, so it's something that doesn't exist. And then like with agape, is that how you would say it, love? Agapeic love is something where you then empty yourself because you recognize that you do not exist absent other, like which I feel like is like something like others, bodies, whatever it was. But what does that mean for cells of the original state? If it's vacuous like that.
So that's why. So again, that's a perfect question, right? That was one of the things that I was trying to get at with this idea of being and not being. Not being isn't the privation of being or the exact opposite of being as action and nothing, right? So that when we find ourselves in a state of meaninglessness or nothingnessness, it's actually a recognition of a relation to the good, to the hope, to desire. And so that what we find is that nothing already has something in it, already has the beauty in it. That what we often do, we get bogged down into this nothing, and then we think we have to create it, create meaning all by ourselves. What Plato is saying is no, the erotic, the suffering also has this resource in it. That when you're staying up late at night and you think it all means nothing, that you are thinking it all means nothing shows the beauty of what it means to be human, of what it means to despair, right? That in your desire for there to be meaning, you're desiring meaning. Like you're putting yourself in relationship with what is other than the lowly human, and showing that you're not just a lowly human, you're this mixture between immanence and transcendence, the ugly and the beautiful. So lots of people sit in the ugly and stay in despair. And I think Plato really emphasizes this, like with Aristophanes, that we often do just stay stagnant in that nothingness. And then we become a sophist, and we become power hungry, because we think that's all there is to get what I want when I want it. Rather than being recognizing, no, that nothingness, that sitting in my suffering is also a site where I see the beauty of it.
If the gist of your question is what's the original state of the self, I want to say that's one of Descartes' errors, is to think of the self as an origin, which it is not. There is no original state of the self. The self only comes to find itself at dusk, too late. Always arrives at a party and everyone else has gone home. That's what it is to be a self, as it were. And so too for the God man, who also never existed by himself, as it were. But we speak of Trinity, things like that. And I've had you in class, and I'm
It's Brooke.
Brooke.
Yes. I have a question for you. So it sounds like to love Agape is a very self-sacrificing kind of love. That's like perspective of love. So what would you say to someone who comes into being, now exists, and doesn't feel embedded in anyone else, or doesn't take action that emphasize that kind of love?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what would I say to them? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I guess
Yeah.
like, how are they living out their souls?
Yeah. Well, before I would try to tell this person that they're living poorly ethically or religiously, which which that kind of person, there would be no point in telling them that anyway, right? So rather, because they wouldn't care. What I would try to tell that person is to say that they are simply wrong experientially, phenomenologically. They're not giving an appropriate account of themselves and their relationships to others. And that I would try to just reframe their self-experience, as it were, and show that first and foremost, self-experience is an experience of being indebted to the other, so that I'm not there, and then I can decide, do I want to be ethical or not, but that I just am ethically obligated all the way down. If I were not ethically obligated to the other, I simply would not be, full stop. It is what I would try to see.
Let's fight it out. Sorry.
No, let's be tyrants and just be arbitrary.
Oh, okay. That's not very erotic of you.
I don't know. And say the last thing.
How you encounter the arguments against that?
Yeah, well, I'll start there. How I would counter the arguments against it is to say, if I first say that the subject of the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection is God, then it does. Then I don't know how to avoid the conclusion that becoming human is a loss of divinity, right? But that's not orthodoxy, right? I'm supposed to say fully God and fully human, not half and half. It's not like my milk or whatever, right? It's supposed to be 100%, 100%, not a math, in other words. And so if I have to say it's fully God and fully human, I have to avoid being able to say things like, despite being a human, he's still God. I have to be able to say things with only a God because he was human. And I think I can do this because if we will say that a God that doesn't love is not a God, and then let's say the most original nature of love is to love Agapeic, right? And so then we can ask, well, what does it mean to love Agapeically? It's empty oneself out, it's self-sacrifice. And I said, oh, holy moly. And I see this in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And so I would simply want to make at that point theological and historical claims and say, so it is. But here I'll add on a little more than what you asked. I think what this buys us, though, is this gives us a very specific God rather than a generic God. So I don't have God, which can mean anything and everything that anyone would want it to mean, and then any other name for God. I'm like, well, those are really all the same. Why do they have different names? Well, I don't know, because it's interesting that way. It'd be boring. And I would say, no, but certain gods do things that other gods don't do. Certain gods climb down on a ladder and wrestle with Jacob and part the Red Sea and show Moses the backside, which are ludicrous enough. And then do other really ludicrous things, like become incarnate and die on a cross, and although having the world by divine right and by human right, rather abandon it all, and although they're gods and are supposed to be powerful, lives like a schmuck in the middle of nowhere. Right? I only know one God. I don't know any of them.
And this is where we would radically disagree. So.
I'll let you be arbitrary.
Somebody I don't know. Green.
About the erotic, I had a question about the erotic nature. In practical terms, since the erotic is designated within a patriarchal society to the marginalized, that is feminism. How in practical terms do you structure that? How like being vulnerable often has great risks?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a great question. And the problem is that there's no easy answer to it, right? I tend to show Dante's Lemonade and Serena Williams, which he has to be incarnating and how it's the potential for the threat, the pornographic days, the patriarchal, colonialist, white, racist days, wants to confront this thing, right? Serena Williams is like, right? See her like twisting and showing that she knows what you're doing. I know you're turning me into an object, but you can't. Right? It's not possible, right? No matter how much you want to make me mean nothing, you don't have that power over me. I think that really shows that. But it's a risk, right? And she has to live with that risk. And I think that's the thing, is that we all have to live with that risk and recognize that a lot of people are risking everything. And we do the work of seeing that they need us to risk with them, to be vulnerable, to be scared, to be stupid, right? So what I love about the concept of world traveling in science, right, is that when you're trying to enter in and to understand the world of people worlds you don't understand or know, that you have to let yourself be foolish. You need to empty yourself out before the other, and also it's not. So what I like about Lugano too is that the seriousness is in the playfulness. That you learn to laugh at your mistakes and where you go wrong, and learn to be able to internalize some of your views. So I'm just rambling now, but the point is, the risk is great and severe, and even more for those who are often being the site for power over, or pornographic, or turning something like this into something lewd or wrong, rather than part of what it means to be beautiful.
One of the risks is being overcome by evil or overcome by injustice. And you want to say, well, how do I not let that happen? And I want to say, no, let that happen.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's because that's where the power is that when people see the brokenness and like expose, like there's entire peoples who've let themselves not be made nothing by those and to still show that power, as I was saying with Tritten, like, yeah, I'm willing to be made nothing by others, because I know that that's actually where my power is.
But don't even resist letting this injustice be done to you, because if you resist, it invokes a counter reaction. But in a certain sense, to take a blow and not return it, or to take a blow and say, and you can blow me again here, that puts an end to power dynamics. Personally, that's not a political
Yeah, it's not a
solution,
political thing.
mind you.
So the erotic and the
That's not a
Agapeic
political solution.
are in some sense not political, right? But it's rather this like actual like connection between a kind of two persons, right? And whether that person be the good or the beautiful, or the one that is, you know, transcendent, or the good or the beautiful, the one in the person before you. But the problem is that the political comes into it because we conceive of power in certain ways, and we're so scared of this, the power of the individual.
One more.
Oh goodness, I don't know. Who thinks they have the best question? I don't know.
Just go. This person has what I'm going to take as a Christmas sweater. Yes. Is that a Christmas sweater?
Yeah. So I have a question about this again. So you talked about the human body and soul, mind, and then spirit, and the idea of being dead and like your body is soul. So I'm wondering if this, or how this goes to body autonomy, or in like the body in that sense, or is the body just not?
Yeah. Okay. So I take it the question is about body autonomy. What I might have to say about that. That just
like not just like in general, like just like what like role, like so what role does the body play in
in a certain sense, if you're listening carefully, basically I said whether you're male or female, or whether you are currently pregnant or not, you are all pregnant. In other words, because you're all bearing the being of the other, always, right? And I take it that a conclusion of that is that it troubles our traditional ways that we think of things like body autonomy, right? Which actually is interesting in our time. I mean, of course, there's classic debates about like abortion, but it's also interesting for us when Green Bay Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers doesn't get vaccinated and says because it's of a bodily autonomy, right? Now, whether I think that's right or wrong is not the issue, but I think it's interesting because I think probably a lot of the same people that are like Aaron Rodgers is a fool for saying that would nevertheless use the same premise for something like an abortion and take it from the side, right? So I think that sometimes we will unevenly invoke body autonomy. I mean, that I'll go on record as saying it. I think we invoke it unevenly. Sometimes we like it, sometimes we say, oh, I don't know. But I would say, for me, body autonomy, there is such a thing, but it is not what is most fundamental and original about the body. Originally, the body is not my and this I learned from the reading of Gaiju's story in Plato, in fact.
And I might respond too that one of the reasons why, you know, with the erotic, and I use the example of, you know, watching a woman dance, that there's a sense that Tyler may be right in that so far as that the other has this kind of control over me to turn me into a mere sex worker or whatever, you know, name somebody wants to reduce me or somebody else to. But I would argue that what's fundamentally interesting is that, you know, there's still this slip of the other that always escapes that particular way of, so I would aggressively say that you might think you have some right over my body or what it is that I am, but there's always something of me that is inescapable, and that I have, like, to appeal to autonomy is to appeal to that. I'm going to hold on to that treasure of the inescapable. That's mine. You can't tell me what to do with my body.
So that was by fiat, the last question. So thanks for coming. I don't know if you have parting words typically. I don't
Just
recall.
that, I do want to thank, let's thank our speakers.